Are you struggling to figure out why your compost pile is not heating up? Maybe you've even given up on getting your compost to heat up altogether. In this video, I am going to help you diagnose and cure your compost ailments, specifically your hot compost problems. We're going to walk through everything that you need to know about setting things up the right way, how to get your pile to actually heat up, and I'm even going to build a few compost piles the wrong way and then show you what you could do to salvage them, to get them to heat up and to decompose quickly into beautiful compost that you can use in your garden this growing season. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Taylor and I help home gardeners turn their yards into sustainable and regenerative growing spaces. And if you'd like to connect with me and get gardening resources, you can check out my free community. It'll be linked in the description, or you can scan the code on the screen. I've talked about this before, but compost is one of the most coveted gardening tools for a reason. And the main reason that I see is because of its overarching effectiveness in improving poor soil. Compost is decomposed organic matter. And on the one hand, there's nothing all that special about that. But well-made compost, properly decomposed organic matter, can do a lot. Feeds soil biology, it adds soil biology, it adds nutrients to the soil, it improves the structure of the soil, it helps with water retention, it can loosen up clay-rich soil, and it can firm up sandy soil. And it does all of this in a variety of ways. You can take my word for it or the word of many other gardeners, but for the sake of providing an immediate visual, check out this pot full of sand. Look at what happens when you pour water through it. Some of you are saying, yeah, I didn't need to see that that's what's happening. It's going on in my garden right now. Okay, now look at what happens when you mix compost with the sand. Looks pretty nice. How does it affect the drainage, I wonder?
The specific thing here that I want to point out is that the length of time it takes for the water to pass through each of these soils, the pure sand and the sand mixed with the compost, is drastically affected. It took about 4 times as long for the water to pass through the sand mixed with compost as it did just the pure sand, which, if you have sandy soil, means that compost, simply by being mixed up a little into your soil, will greatly improve the water retention.
Now I'm focusing in on the water retention because when soil is bone dry, microbial activity stops. Every living thing on earth needs some amount of water, and microbes prefer a lot. Now I got a lot of flack for a video that we made a few weeks ago where I was encouraging people to work on restoring their native soil rather than just ignoring it and building raised beds on top of the soil. One commenter went so far as to say, "You've never tried to restore dead sandy soil. You give bad advice and your opinions are made up." To which I will say, actually, I have tried to restore dead sandy soil. Here's the soil from part of our property to which we have done nothing, and it's pretty indicative of how we found the soil on most of our property. Here in the backyard, though, we worked on building soil from scratch, and one of the best things that we did was spread a ton of compost. There were other things that we did as well, but take a look at the difference. All that is to say, compost is a very, very helpful tool for every gardener, whether you're growing in pots or in raised beds or on acreage in ground. But here's the thing, not all compost is created equal. Decomposed organic matter is a very broad definition. And so to set us up for success when we go to talk about how to make the very best possible compost that you can make at home, we need to know what properly made compost is made out of. And there are a few types of compost that we can look at to kind of start to get an idea for this. The first being municipal composts. These composts are made from the food scraps, paper products, and yard debris from the residents in that municipality. Now, items that are not accepted in these compost operations are plastics, glass, metal, treated wood, hazardous waste, household garbage, and other non-organic material. However, having bought municipal compost, I can tell you that I've absolutely found plastic, glass, metal, and other random things that made it through the screener. Which means that, and I know that this is a shocker here, but my neighbors didn't follow the directions for their yard waste bins, and the materials weren't sorted through by the workers at the compost facility. Now, this is not the worst thing in the world, and certainly some of these types of composts are going to be higher quality than others, but generally speaking, it's pretty hard to know exactly what went into these composts. What you can very likely guarantee is that when you get these delivered or you pick them up yourself, they're going to contain very little microbial activity. Reason being, these facilities need to process the materials that they get as fast as humanly possible, and they also need to ensure that any potential pathogens in the materials are killed off. When temperatures of a compost pile rise to above 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 Celsius, pathogens and weed seeds get killed and the material becomes safe to use. But past 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 Celsius, the beneficial microbes start to get roasted and you lose a lot of that biological diversity that you'd otherwise get if the compost stayed under 160. Thing is, with the massive windrows that the city compost operations are building, you don't really know unless they say specifically if they're monitoring temps at all. Most likely, temperatures have been left to exceed the upper ranges and can get into the 170s and beyond. So what are you getting when you buy in your average municipal compost? Most likely you're getting some organic matter without much in the way of microbial activity. And this is not a bad thing altogether, especially if you're trying to cover a large space and you just want to get started increasing the organic matter contents of your soil. This can really get you going, and you can use some microbial inoculants to help infuse your soil with biology, stuff like the Jadam microbial solution, lactic acid bacteria, diluted seawater, and of course IMO4 are going to be huge helps here. But what about options for buying compost that comes preloaded with verified microbial activity? There are brands of compost that you can buy by the bag that contain microbes, at least according to the label. These composts are typically made and then pasteurized by heating up the materials to make sure that all the microbial activity is gone, both the good and the bad. And then they are intentionally re-inoculated with mycorrhizae spores or worm castings or other microbes. And then they're bagged up and sold. Now, we could discuss this technique and if it's getting exactly what you want, but all in all, if you're gonna go the store-bought route, this is probably gonna be your best option. If you're growing in less than 100 square feet, this might be the best route for you to take. And we'll talk a little bit about how to calculate how much compost you need in a minute. But if you're building a lot of soil from scratch, or if you're trying to cover hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of square feet, this path is not going to be financially viable for most of us. Not only that, I'm convinced that the compost that I make at home is as good, if not better quality than the nice bagged stuff. I typically make my compost in 1 cubic yard increments, batches, which compresses down a little bit, probably into 2/3 of a yard or about 18 cubic feet, half a cubic meter. And if I were to buy that much in bagged compost, I'm looking at anywhere between $400 to $500 for a single pile. Again, the main reason that I make my own though is because I'm confident in my ability to make the good stuff. And I'm gonna show you how you can as well, so you can feel just as confident. So how do you make amazing compost? Based on our broad definition of compost, decompose organic matter, the easiest answer that I can give you is let organic matter decompose. But as we've already discussed, it's not quite that simple if you want to make the good stuff, and certainly not that simple if you want to make it in a reasonable length of time. You could pile up wood chips, leave them to decompose, come back 10 years later and still not have compost. You could make a massive pile of banana peels, cover them up, come back in a few weeks and find sludge crawling with maggots. But why is that? And if this discussion is too basic for you, feel free to skip to the troubleshooting section of the video. But I want to make sure that y'all know what is happening here so that you can understand how to make really good compost. Broadly speaking, compost is made from 2 basic ingredients: materials that contain a high amount of nitrogen and materials that contain a very high amount of carbon. And when you have both carbon and nitrogen, microorganisms that are already in and on these materials now get a sort of balanced diet. Think about your own meals. You want a bit of carbohydrates, you want a little bit of healthy fat, you want some protein, and if you completely cut out any of these foods, over time, your body will struggle to function. Same goes with a lot of microorganisms. Microbes need nitrogen-rich foods and carbon-rich foods. And of course, that is a super simple explanation. In reality, different types of microbes need different types and amounts of each of these. But for the purposes of making good quality compost quickly, we got to have both. And to get the temperatures of our pile to rise, we're sort of shooting for equal parts carbon to nitrogen. Now, when we say equal parts, is that volume or weight or just eyeballing it? This is where things get a little tricky and why it's better to learn techniques rather than recipes. Compost making, I like to say, is more like cooking than it is like baking. It's not really an exact science in one sense because there are a lot of factors at play all at once. Other than roughly equal parts carbon and nitrogen, the other 2 things that microbes need are water and air, which again, if you think about yourself, is pretty intuitive. You got to have air and water to live. When any of these factors is out of balance, decomposition will either slow down or start swinging in a direction that is unhelpful or unfavorable for your compost. And the reason that we're trying to speed up the decomposition process is because the more decomposed our materials are, the closer the microorganisms in the soil are to being able to deliver bioavailable nutrients to your plants. That's maybe a little bit overly technical, but I felt like that needed to be said. Compost that looks like soil rather than a combination of ingredients is going to be ready to impart actual nutrients. So when we're building a compost pile, these components are all things that go into it. Oversaturated compost, compost that's too wet, will start to harbor anaerobic microorganisms that will limit the microbial diversity. It's going to slow down decomposition and potentially give us unhealthy material to work with. Undersaturated compost, compost that's too dry, won't allow microbes to transport themselves, and they'll start to desiccate and decrease in activity. Compost with too much nitrogen will overheat quickly and kill off microbial diversity. Compost with too little nitrogen won't heat up enough to establish healthy cultures. Now, if all of this sounds too complex, fret not. You honestly don't need to know exact amounts of everything, and you certainly don't need to be meticulous in measuring out specific ingredients and perfectly monitoring the entire decomposition process. I'm just setting the stage for how we're going to diagnose your compost issues. Now, something I've been mentioning a lot in this discussion is temperatures, right? Why are higher temperatures a good thing? What is it about this temperature range between 130, 160 that gives us a good result? Well, within that range, as I've already mentioned, we can be fairly sure that diseases and pathogens that come in on our materials will be killed off. We also ensure that weed seeds, and maybe even more importantly, weed rhizomes, are killed off once we get above 130 Fahrenheit. But the other thing that happens in that range is that a certain set of microorganisms enter the scene and really establish themselves in this temperature range. And those microbes are what we call the thermophiles, heat lovers. So for bacteria, we're talking about primarily bacilli, and on the upper end of the temperature range, thermos bacteria. We also see actinomycetes and thermophilic compost piles. And the way that you know that those are present is because you'll see these white thread-like strands that appear to look like mycelium. These guys look and act very much like fungi in that they decompose complex organic materials like woody debris, but they are in fact bacteria. Now, fungi will also be present in your compost piles when the temperatures are high, but they actually are going to favor the outer edges of the pile for survival's sake. Fungi are going to re-enter the scene when the temperatures drop down a bit lower into the mesophilic ranges below 120 Fahrenheit. But why do we want those high temperatures in the first place? Well, in short, there's a lot of work that thermophilic bacteria can do in a short amount of time when the temperatures are high. Higher temperatures means faster decomposition. And again, the more that materials have decomposed, the closer they are to directly benefiting the plants in your garden. If you have any other questions about how to get your compost to heat up, leave a comment or join my free gardening community. You can send me a message there and check out free resources to help you out. But I'm going to go ahead and answer what I think are the most common questions that you might possibly have. Of course, I won't be able to speak to your exact situation, but I'll do my best. And I'm going to take these, we'll call them compost roadblocks, one at a time, from most common to least, again, in my estimation. The first and most common roadblock that I'm going to guess for most home gardeners trying to make their own hot compost is a lack of nitrogen. It's really easy to underestimate how much nitrogen it takes to counterbalance carbon material. Carbons don't really break down on their own very fast. They need nitrogen. And of course, by they, I'm referring to the microorganisms in the carbon materials. Anytime that I have tried skimping on my nitrogen additions to a compost pile, I've regretted it. Now, of course, you can also go a little bit overboard on the nitrogen, but I think that's far less likely to happen. And I think that the main reason not enough nitrogen is an issue is because, on the flip side, carbon is very easy to source and store, whereas nitrogen is harder to come by and has a shelf life. What I mean by that is that if you take comfrey leaves and add them to a compost pile fresh, like within a few hours of cutting, the nitrogen content in those comfrey leaves will be very high. However, if you were to spread comfrey leaves across the soil and leave them for a week, you'd very quickly see them turn brown and become crumbly, especially if the sun is beating down on them. So what's happening there? Well, at a certain level, plants are alive for a little while after being harvested. A little morbid, but technically true. And while they're alive, they've still got nitrogen in them.
And that's my super simplified way of explaining it. Really, what you need to know is that you can't cut your grass hoping to stockpile on nitrogen until you're ready to build a full-sized pile, which means that you need a lot all at once. And you might be asking, does that mean that we're losing all the nitrogen once the pile starts heating up? And the answer there is yes and no. The plant material is losing nitrogen, but it's mostly retained inside of the microbes' bodies, which means that it's kind of locked into a stable state. Once the microbes get into the soil, eventually they'll pass on to the next life and leave their bodies behind to re-impart that nitrogen to the soil, or they'll give it to the plants. Of course, with hot compost piles, you'll lose some amount of nitrogen to off-gassing. In a pile that gets too hot, you're obviously going to be losing a lot more nitrogen. One way to partially mitigate this, by the way, would be to add a thin layer of charcoal to the top of your pile. I usually do this if I've got some extra on hand, and doing that helps capture some of that off-gassing nitrogen because the charcoal absorbs it. But most of the time, all of this means that the nitrogen is going to be your limiting factor for making hot compost. And this is where you need to be a little bit more intentional. I know it's scary in our anti-social world, but a really easy, simple way of getting your hands on some more nitrogen-rich material is to talk to people. Speak to your neighbors and ask them if you could have some of their lawn clippings. Especially if you see them just piling them up in the back of their yard and never using them. Other people you could talk to would be coffee shops. Call in advance or just show up unannounced and ask if they have any unused coffee grounds. If you're making compost often, like once a week or once a month, you could even try to set up a system where your local coffee shop saves them for you and you can pick them up throughout the week. Just trying to give you ideas here. Look on Facebook Marketplace for people who are giving away manure from their livestock. Or if you have access, you could just drive out into the country near you and look for horses. Where there are horses, there will be manure. And I've never met someone who has said, no, I'm literally using 100% of my horse manure for my garden. Another way of stockpiling nitrogen is doing bokashi. Bokashi compost, or pre-fermenting your food scraps, is a way to actually lock in that nitrogen and save it until you're ready to use it in a pile. You can also bokashi ferment comfrey leaves, grass clippings, weeds, all of that nitrogen-rich plant matter, and save it. On the flip side, and this is actually a slightly different issue than having too little nitrogen, but something that I think can really mess up piles comes down to the source of carbon-rich materials. A pound of dried leaves contains far less carbon than a pound of wood chips, which means that it takes a lot more nitrogen to break down wood chips than it does to break down leaves. Of course, big chunks of wood chips will take even longer to decompose than small, finely ground up wood chips. But for this reason, I prefer using wood chips sparingly in my compost piles, woody debris of any kind really, and I see it more as a small added ingredient that helps different types of actinomycetes and fungi to enter the scene when we get past the thermophilic stage of the process. If this all feels a little confusing to you, you can take a screenshot of this key to get a general idea of how high in carbon to how high in nitrogen various ingredients are. Keep in mind, this is a very general idea just to get you started. You can see that adding poultry manure to your pile will generally give you a higher amount of nitrogen compared to coffee grounds, for example. Wood chips are going to have a significantly higher amount of carbon compared to leaves. All of these ingredients have a range, and you really don't need to take the time to measure out exact amounts. Only reason I wanted to share that with you is to give you an idea of how you could technically mix equal parts leaves and horse manure together and get a pile to heat up, but then you probably couldn't mix wood chips and horse manure together in the same amounts and get the same result. Something that you might be thinking, especially if you haven't made a pile like this before, is why am I so focused on getting a whole bunch of materials to make compost? Why can't I just build a pile that is the size of whatever materials I have on hand? And you absolutely can make that compost pile. You can gradually toss yard debris and food scraps into your compost bin or bay and just let it sit and decompose. However, in order to help it decompose quickly, we need the heat. And to retain the heat, we need a high volume. Volume, or the size of your pile, is a crucial component of not only the heat being generated, but of heat being retained. If you've got a small pile, all of that heat from the microbial activity is going to escape and dissipate faster than it can be retained and increased. Another huge factor for hot compost specifically, probably really obvious, but just the starting temperature of your ingredients, and by extension, the ambient or the outdoor temperatures. If your materials are frozen solid, it doesn't really matter how much nitrogen you've got, your pile will not heat up. If it's a 100-degree day out, of course your pile is going to be a lot closer to that 130-degree range. That said, with sky-high ambient temperatures comes a different roadblock, at least in my area, and that is humidity. We are growing in a very dry climate, which means that our compost piles are generally going to fall on the thirstier than normal side. With heat comes evaporation, so every time that you flip your pile, make sure to assess the moisture content and reapply water as needed to keep the materials properly saturated. Now, speaking of aeration, flipping or mixing up your pile will help to reintroduce oxygen back into the party, and it's a pretty important factor. Just like when you flip your compost and assess the dryness of the materials, also check to make sure that they're not too wet. Again, this is all very hard to exactly define without being able to just hand you appropriately damp compost material, so you'll have to actually make a pile and experience it for yourself if you're going to get an idea of how this goes. Now, I wanted to actually show you how I would go about diagnosing and solving a chili compost pile that I wanted to heat up. And so I went ahead and built 2 piles for this video. The first one that I made, I went for pretty equal parts carbon to nitrogen. The carbon material was actually a different pile that I had made that I never got to generate that much heat. So in a sense, I'm sort of just fixing that pile. And then for the nitrogen content, I just have a bunch of green materials from the yard, lots of weeds that I collected. I added 25 gallons of greens to this pile. And then for the other pile, I pulled out chicken pen bedding and mixed it up with 5 gallons of greens. Now, I didn't wet down either of these piles at all. The materials that I had weren't particularly dry, but they also weren't wet exactly.
Okay, so I went ahead and built 2 compost piles. These are each about 3 feet high. The idea here is that I wanted to build 2 piles that are made from roughly the same materials, but that are just with different quantities. For the nitrogen-rich materials in both piles, we've got grass clippings, weeds that I collected around the yard and shredded in my lawnmower, and then comfrey leaves. And the difference is that in this pile, we've got 5 5-gallon buckets worth, and in that pile, there's 1 5-gallon bucket. For the other nitrogen-rich materials, we've also got chicken manure mixed up in the chicken bedding, which is my primary kind of media that I use for making compost. The other materials in the compost pile are a lot of the carbon-rich materials. Leaf mold, at this point, it's practically leaf mold, shredded up leaves, straw, wood chips, and then I added some more straw to this pile just to give it a little bit of size, a little bit of volume rather. And so what we'll do is over the next couple days, we'll just monitor the temperatures of these piles. And my guess is that this pile is going to heat up. I'm pretty certain this one's just going to heat up to that 130 to 160 Fahrenheit range, get the thermophilic microbes kind of locked in. And then that pile is not quite going to heat up. Again, that's my guess. So the whole idea here though is that I'm gonna actually then just in a couple days when we see the difference in temperature, I'll make some additions to this pile and I'll show you how you can kind of workshop trying to figure out how to heat it up. Because it's also possible, like I didn't wet down any of this material. There's a lot of moisture in the greens and there is moisture in the chicken bedding. But compost, as the microbial activity increases and as it heats up, that moisture is lost in part. And so it's possible we'll need to wet it down. We'll certainly, I'm guessing, need to add more green material or more nitrogen-rich material. So I'll show you how you can kind of do that. And we're gonna save this pile, even though I'm making it right now. All right, so on day 4 now, and these piles have just barely started to heat up. Not really as much as I would have expected, which is great because that means that we get to workshop some solutions. So the nitrogen-rich pile is at 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Ironically, the carbon-heavy pile is at like 84. And my only thoughts for why that could be would be that there was just a lot of chicken manure in the chicken bedding that I took out. It's just more than I expected. That's the most likely thing. The other thing that I can think of is that I did toss some IMO3 into the chicken pen not long before pulling it out. The IMO3 had overheated. If you're familiar with IMO3, it's a KNF thing, has a lot of strong microbial activity. So some of that could have gotten into this pile to make it really start to heat up a little bit faster. Otherwise, I'm not entirely sure. But we're gonna take these piles apart and then I'm gonna address just the issues that I see. My guess, just looking at this one, is that it's gonna be a tad dry. I've got my hose ready, I'm gonna wet it down, And I'll show you kind of an easy way to flip the pile. I'm gonna flip these piles, mix them up. I'll add some water, and I'll assess for both of them kind of what I think that they need. I'm guessing that this one needs a little bit more moisture as well. Before we add any extra nitrogen, I'm just gonna address the moisture first, just to look at that. And I've got a tarp laid out here. I'm just gonna take the kind of the top off and put it on the tarp. Water is sort of a microbe lubricant, I guess you could say. And so if you don't have that, it's hard for the microbes to travel effectively. This is honestly not looking too dry, although I would say that it needs to be wetted down. So that's probably the only step we're gonna need to take for this one. Also the other thing is the process of just aerating it in general. Flipping it, mixing it up like this will help microbial activity. So that's really two things we're doing, is we're aerating it and we're adding moisture. Aeration and moisture are not at odds with each other. It's not like you have to find a balance between those. If a pile is too damp, it can go anaerobic, which means that there's not proper aeration in the pile, and you can grow microbes that you don't necessarily want, or like slow down decomposition. And so just seeing, like, just as I'm flipping, like mixing the ingredients, I can definitely tell the green material is maybe lost a little bit of its green, but it's still pretty green, which means that, for my experience, that the microbes haven't quite been able to access them or like travel. Their overall ability to transport themselves and to move through this pile is limited because of the moisture content. Maybe around half. And then what I'm gonna do is just pull this tarp to the side, pull it out of the way. Ordinarily, I would just flip this pile into this bay, but I've got some IMO3 in that bay right now. I just basically just transfer these back and forth. So for this method, I'm just putting it on the tarp, and I'll drag the tarp away. Okay, so then I'll just take this out and put it over here. So this is the bottom. A pitchfork is really nice here because you can kind of toss the materials about as you're pulling them out, mix it all up. My chickens are fascinated at this process, probably wondering why I'm not giving them anything. So before I put anything back, like start to mix up this pile and rehydrate it, I just want to show you, hopefully you can see how, like, the general dampness. The sun is actually not making this great, but so it's technically moist, but it's like, if I was to squeeze it, I'm not going to get any water to come out at all. And you can see it just kind of falls apart. The idea is to get it so that it's just wet enough so that, if you squeeze it, a few drops of water is going to come out. And the way I'm going to do that is I'll pull my tarp with my compost back in this direction, and then I'll start to repile. And the stuff that's on my tarp here, stuff that's on the tarp is what came off of the top, so now that's going on the bottom. Sometimes I can get this to set up so that it just sprays continually. That makes it a little bit easier, but let's see if I can do that. Okay, well, I'll just water this down then, little by little. Sorry. Wet this down all the way. Pile's been built. It's nice, and if this is a bit sopping, honestly, this is probably wetter than it needs to be, but at least on top. But then if you go down a little bit, it's pretty dry. So it's gonna balance out, I'm pretty sure, just doing that by feel, really, and having built probably hundreds of compost piles at this point. This is a good feel, picking out some of the pine cones as I see them in the rocks. So there's that. Put the temperature probe in, and then we'll handle this pile over here. And then one other thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and cover these. I'm gonna cover them with cardboard. I forgot to cover them the last time, I just didn't even think about it. But covering your compost piles is pretty helpful for keeping moisture locked in, because especially the top can get very dry in high heat, high temperatures, and in dry climates like mine. So we'll be able to check back in on this in a couple days. Well, we'll check in tomorrow and we'll go from there. But for now, I'm just gonna do the exact same thing that I did with that pile for this pile. Actually, I'm gonna take it apart first and see. It might not actually need any added moisture, but we'll just take a look. And I'm not even gonna use the tarp for this. I'm just gonna pull it down and plop it there. Okay, so just looking at it, probably needs a bit more moisture, I'll say. At least the top does. So really, I'm doing two things, I guess, for these piles, because I'm aerating them or flipping them, mixing them up, and getting them a bit damper. Whoa. Oh my gosh. That is crazy. All right, y'all, check out how big this worm is. Worm is like a snake. I guess it was stretched out a little bit. I feel kind of bad for the guy, but he's playing dead probably. Go ahead and water this down a bit, and then I'll start to repile and water as I go. Since this came off of the top, I want this to be the bottom. Okay, so what I'm gonna do, I'll put the probe in this since I watered it down a little bit more, and then I'll cover these up with my tarp. We'll check back in tomorrow and see how the moisture added has helped or hindered the temperature rise. And again, the reason that, well, I'll probably say this somewhere else in the video, but the reason that we want our temperatures to rise is because we've got weeds in here. Some of these plants have seeds, some of them spread via rhizome, and we want to kill all that off so that we're not spreading weed seeds all over our garden when we go to apply this to the soil or use it in our potting mix. It's also going to kill off any potential pathogens in the chicken poop, make it a little bit more sanitary. In my experience, that's never been a problem, even for cold compost, but you know, better safe than sorry. Well, that's good enough, I think, for now. Check back in tomorrow.
Now, when I checked back in over the next few days, I still did not notice much of an increase in temperature. And so on day 4, after having hydrated the materials, I went ahead and took apart the pile, assessed the dampness, and didn't find anything funky, which meant that we could go on to the next most likely issue, that being, surprise, surprise, we just didn't have enough nitrogen in the pile for things to heat up. And so for this time, I went ahead and it incorporated about 8 gallons of bokashi fermented food scraps, about 3 gallons of coffee grounds, and a couple of 50-pound bags of rabbit manure. I really wanted to get these mixed up in the existing materials. This is a good amount of nitrogen, and I didn't want any clumps in there to risk those going anaerobic, as well as I just wanted to make sure that it was all mixed up properly so the pile could start to balance out. Few things to point out here are that I'm choosing to wait until the 4th day after reassembling the pile each time, right? And the reason being because it can take a few days for the microbes in the pile to get settled, kind of settled in to start and really become active. Once piles start heating up, there's a sort of snowball effect, but until that heat starts building up, it can take a few days for any real activity to show up. In other words, be patient, and be patient with the whole process itself, with your process. As I said earlier, I've built probably over 100 compost piles, at least many dozen, and I still didn't quite build this one the exact right way the first time. Could be that I underestimated the amount of carbon in the pre-existing materials that I used. Could be that I just needed to add twice as many greens in the first time. And this is just really illustrating the point that I made earlier. It's easier to under-add nitrogen than to overdo it in most cases. Most of the time, if your pile isn't heating up, it's because you didn't add enough nitrogen sources. I went ahead and piled this one back up, and I didn't touch the other pile just to sort of see what it would do. Also, I still had a little bit more manure, bokashi, and coffee ground that I could have used, but I wanted to hold on to them and make sure that I didn't need them for the main pile that I was working on getting going.
Okay, here we are 4 days later. The tarp off. And we're getting right past 130 just today. It'll probably keep rising. That solved the issue, this pile. And now we can go ahead and start adding the other nitrogen materials to this pile. And this pile is like just a touch over ambient temps. It's about 60 degrees this morning, but you can see all these weeds sprouting. And I think actually a lot of this is just from the straw. So keep that in mind if you're using straw. People say that hay has weeds and straw doesn't, but almost always had straw that sprouts. One more time, I actually wanted to pop back in. We're about 10 hours later and we've jumped 25 degrees-ish. Point here is just that when you get into this thermophilic range, on these thermometers. It's kind of in that gray area, between 130, 160. The pile starts heating up. It's generating and retaining the heat very quickly. And so you need to start to keep an eye on it to make sure that you didn't add too much nitrogen. I can feel the heat radiating from it already, and then you can monitor it from there. Now, a big question is, how much compost do I actually need? General rule of thumb for no-till gardening is 1 to 2 inches applied once a year to established garden beds. And if you're starting a brand new garden bed, you're gonna wanna lay down compost on top of the native soil that you already have, and you wanna pile it up 6 inches deep to start your garden bed. So calculate the amount of existing growing space that you have and multiply that square footage by 0.083 feet. And that number is the amount of cubic feet of compost that you'll need. Divide that number by 27 and you'll get how many cubic yards you need. Again, for existing garden beds. For new garden beds that you want to start, take your square footage and multiply it by 0.5 feet. And that is going to give you the cubic feet that you need. Again, divided by 27, and you'll get the exact amount of cubic yards. Now, how does this help? Well, if you're making a lot of compost, I suggest that you have a specified zone in your yard for making compost. For our yard, we've got this multiple bay system where we can get materials from the chicken coop and then start mixing them with other materials. Each of these bays is actually about 40 cubic feet in volume. It's about 3.5 feet across, deep and high. And the reason that I made these a touch larger than 27 cubic feet is because materials compress and lose their volume over time, and I've noticed that our compost will shrink by about 30% by the time it's finished. Therefore, I know that if I can fill up one of these bays, I can get it to heat up and decompose quickly. I can have a cubic yard of finished compost after about a month of building the pile. One of these piles covers 54 square feet of brand new growing space, or 325 square feet of established garden bed. From there, it's just math and consistency in making more compost. Now, big thing for a lot of home gardeners is the idea of making hot compost is just too big of a project to wrap your mind around. Maybe it's the amount of material, maybe it's the maintenance, maybe it is the exercise that's required. Whatever it is, there are reasons why people don't want to make a huge pile all at once. And so the question, what about cold compost, is what you might be asking. And what I'll say is cold compost is not only completely okay to make, it's also potentially even better than hot compost. And in some cases might be preferable. But there are some huge mistakes that people can make here too. So cold compost isn't really an official term, by the way. I'm just referring to compost that you can make that doesn't reach the thermophilic temps. The main downside is just the time that it takes to create compost when you're not heating it up. Remember that heat really speeds up decomposition. But let's say that you don't care about making compost very quickly. You just want to make 1 pile per year and call it good. What you can do is choose a spot in your yard where you'll toss your coffee grounds, your fruit and veggie peels, and your yard waste material. And then over the course of the season, just build the pile until it reaches around 3 feet in height or about 1 meter high. And once you get to that point, I'd say go ahead and mix it up once. You can do this by flipping the pile to an adjacent spot, or you can try spreading it out and repile it in the same spot. Main thing is that you want to take the pile down and then re-stack it up. And when you do this, you're just looking to manage the moisture content of the materials in the pile. If you crack it open and there's sludge in the middle of the pile and it smells bad, you need to address that by either spreading it out and letting it dry a bit, or mixing in some dried leaves or wood chips or something to soak up the moisture and maybe build some built up nitrogen. If the materials are bone dry, you need to wet them down, obviously, to make sure that the microbial activity can continue. And then once you restack the pile, you need to keep it covered, probably with a tarp or some cardboard or something. And then the rule is that you stop adding materials to it, because whenever you add new materials, those materials are now on a different timeline, a different track toward decomposing. So you want all of your mixed up compost materials to decompose at roughly the same time. Now, if you can chop up your materials beforehand too, get them a little finely shredded, that is definitely going to help with decomposition speed. But overall, once you've covered up that pile, you don't want to use that stuff for another 6 months to a year. So on a strategic side, if you build a cold compost pile over the course of the spring, you build it, let it decompose all summer long, covered up, of course. And then in the late fall, you can go to spread that compost out a bit over your soil so that it can continue decomposing all winter long in place. If you build a pile in the fall and let it sit all winter, in my climate where it gets really cold during the winter, I'm going to say that you still might want to let it sit all summer long. before using it in the garden, mainly to make sure that the weeds have had the chance to sprout in the pile and die off, which is one of the reasons that you're keeping it covered while it ages. If you're certain that you don't have any weed seeds or rhizomes in there, you could probably spread it a bit earlier out across your garden. Now, what are the benefits of making cold compost? Well, you obviously don't need to stockpile any ingredients. You can just sort of add as you go until you have a good sized pile. But the main benefit is that because you're opting for slower decomposition, you're getting a more mature finished product from a microbial standpoint. And you're maybe a bit more likely to get a more fungal rich compost out of it, because especially if you're not disturbing it and you have a bit more carbon than nitrogen in there, those fungal cultures are going to use that time to really lock in and get established. So when you go and uncover that pile, you might see a lot of white fungal bloom covering the outside. You might even see hyphal strands infusing the materials in the pile. And with this slower decomposition, you're also preserving around 100% of the nitrogen that you do have in the pile, because it's been allowed to decompose and stabilize really gently. Now, personally, I like getting that hot compost pile made and then letting it age for a little while after it's cooled down. That's how I like to do it most of the time. And that way I know that I can just use it pretty much whenever I want. It's obviously going to be up to you how you want to go. Now, a couple of downsides to the cold compost approach is that if you have issues attracting pests like raccoons and rats, they will be very likely attracted to the food scraps that you toss in your pile. Of course, if you go the bokashi route for your food scraps, you can fix that problem. Animals are not attracted to acidic materials. Another mistake that I think a lot of people make is when they toss food scraps into a compost bin, and maybe they add some grass clippings and yard debris in there too, but they neglect balancing them things out with carbon. Those containers that seal up are perfect zones to brew up some nasty, gross, sludgy sludge that only by the loosest definitions can be called compost. The best tool that you have for making healthy compost, whether hot or cold, is your nose. If it smells bad, something's gone wrong. And by bad, I just mean like sulfury, poopy, bad breathy, urea-y. Any of those strong odors is a sign that you've got a misbalance of carbon to nitrogen, or you've got anaerobic conditions in the pile. So if this is the case, if you open up your compost tumbler and a zillion flies swarm out and it smells like a swamp, dump it out, mix some wood chips or leaves or straw, and until the odor starts to disappear, and then put it back in. Now, we aren't going to go into the bonus ingredients that I like to add to all of my compost piles, because this video is already a little bit long and I don't want to overcomplicate it. But if you have all of your liquid Korean natural farming inputs on hand and made, your compost pile is a great place to use them. Always heavily diluted. So if you want to add lactic acid bacteria, some fermented plant juice, some vinegar, just dilute them 1 to 500 in a bucket of water and use that to saturate some of the materials as you go. For OHN and fermented fish amino acids, you want to dilute those a little bit more, 1 to 1,000, and then you can also incorporate some seawater, diluted 1 to 30 for some added biology. All of these inputs are great additions to your compost pile at any point, even if it's cooled down a bit and you're just letting it age. Gently pour a bucket of these inputs over the top of the pile, let them soak it up, and you're sort of supercharging your compost with extra compounds. All right, y'all, this was a pretty thorough video. I wanted to help you troubleshoot your compost this season by answering your questions regarding the hot compost and compost in general. Hopefully you learned something new. If you still have questions, leave them in the comments section, and maybe I'll make a part 2, and if there are enough. Also, feel free to join my community and post your questions there, and we can get you the support that you need for whatever project you're working on. You can also learn all about getting started with Korean natural farming and see how it can help launch or relaunch your garden this year. If you want to work with me on your garden this year, you can apply for my Natural Garden Reboot program. And if you found this video helpful and you want to continue to learn how you can stretch your compost a little bit further so that you don't have to make quite so much, you'll want to check out this video next. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.